I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. This episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast helped me welcome recent Dark Mountain contributor, international and local activist, and loving father, James McGowan. All right, I am very excited to be speaking today with a contributor to the Dark Mountain Project. And that contributor is James McGowan. And just a brief introduction to James McGowan is that he's worked with the United Nations for a decade to help build the world's largest environmental grant-making organization. He then chose to refocus on raising a family, restoring his local watershed, and writing. His worldview has been shaped by friendships with Thomas Berry, Vine Deloria, and traditional people from several native nations. And I ran into your work, James, in the recent Dark Mountain posting, and I'm actually reading from here, the Song of Water, Sacred Landscapes, Native Nations and Religious Freedom. A substantial article, and I'm hoping that you'll tour us through what has you do the work that you do, the writing that you do, and make the choices that you do. And I just want to acknowledge what an honor it is to be connected with you today and talking with you. I just have an immense respect for the Dark Mountain Project, and I think it's one of the most civilized, human, and heartful expressions in the face of a predicament-laden world that I've seen. So it's really a pleasure to have you here. I'm going to, of course, for the folks who are watching this who haven't been connected with either Dark Mountain Project or Song of Water, the thing we'll be talking about today, I'm going to be putting the links to those things in the show notes. But James McGowan, thank you very much for joining us, and say hello, and off we go.
Okay, well, thank you. I am sort of nominally in charge of two teenagers at the moment, so hell's always popping around here, and towards the end of the school year, you have class cutting and every sort of hijinks that you could imagine. So I hope I don't get too distracted by that today. But we'll see how it goes. Thank you. No, it was really a great honor to be brought back into the environment field by Thomas Berry himself. I had graduated with a degree in marine science around the time Ronald Reagan came in. So, I'm an old guy now, and what was happening then is that people who were our age were losing their jobs because he was completely cutting back on all funding for anything to do with the environment, as you know, and pumping all of the resources he could into the oil companies that had gotten him elected president. So I kind of, at that point, it was the first time kind of losing heart a little bit, and I was very young and had to do other things to make ends meet, did a number of things. And then was invited by a friend to go to the Riverdale Center for Research one day, where Thomas lived for many years when he was a professor at Fordham University. And, just meeting him was a transformational and inspirational moment. And it was the beginning of a relationship with him that lasted really, until he moved back to North Carolina, where he eventually did die. But at one of he used to have like monthly meetings. And, at one of those meetings, I heard a lecture about, by a lawyer about what was happening in Indian country regarding religious freedom. The religious freedom clause of the Constitution being employed to try to protect traditional native religions, be it use of peyote, use of tobacco, use of animal parts, and also protection of sacred sites. And I was fascinated by that concept, because it seemed to really throw into high relief the conflict, between the two worldviews. The native worldview, which really saw specific sites as their Vaticans, their churches, their really holy places that were inviolate, and the Western point of view, which saw only resources that could be exploited at these sites. And it kind of came to a legal loggerhead in various courts across the country. Mm-hmm. So I went and visited these places and had the honor of meeting the medicine people who were trying to protect these places, and working with also some lawyers from the Native American Rights Fund, doing research. And so that was really the beginning of my kind of return to my roots of my love for the natural world and my interest in protecting the natural world, at all costs, even way back then. And then not too long after, I did get a call from the United Nations who, they were looking for people who understood the environment and who could write about it a bit, because they were starting this new venture called the Global Environment Facility, which is a partnership of the World Bank, United Nations Environment Program, the United Nations Development Program, UNDP. So I was working for UNDP, and the idea with the GF originally was that the World Bank was going to more or less control this thing. But what they found out when the money started to actually flow was that the World Bank was not the right people at all, and that the UN itself in New York, with the expertise they had on the ground with 164 country offices, was the right group to begin to pull in projects that could be funded that would try to protect local ecosystems that were typically transboundary. So we would look at both marine and terrestrial protected areas that might be large across several countries or across several countries' economic zones, be it if we're in the oceans, and to try to just protect as much as we possibly could of biodiversity, international waters, and address climate change, and also ozone depleting chemicals at that time. So the idea was to try to support countries to come into compliance with the new international environmental conventions, which was the Convention on Biological Diversity, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and then later came the Convention to Combat Desertification, and of course the Montreal Protocol, which is one of the very successful international environmental conventions to try to repair the holes in the ozone layer that were forming as a result of CFCs. So many of the countries didn't have the resources, some of the smaller countries, to come into compliance with the convention. So the idea was we were going to fund them to help them to come into compliance with the convention. So that was sort of the legal framework for the GF. And so I worked, for a solid 10 years. And then when my children were born, I sort of trickled off into consultancies as a senior advisor. And then, still to this day, we'll take contracts when something comes up that seems very, interesting and compelling and important. So, in a nutshell, that's my background, kind of my journey. I just discovered, Dark Mountain and many other similar kind of groups along the way. And I really do admire the work that they do and their attitude. And met Paul Kingsnorth when he came to promote his book one time here, and thought, well, maybe I should contribute something based on my experiences, because they were looking at the time with concepts of the sacred and the natural world. Mm-hmm. And so I took a little bit longer than I should have to produce it, but I finally did produce that piece, which was based on tried to be rooted in history a little bit in terms of looking at, of course, these tribes have long predated the Constitution itself, and by thousands of years, and had very good cases actually for the protection of their religious freedom based on that Constitution, though. However, and it was a really a long struggle, and I highlighted a couple of pieces in the article that I think people should take a look at. And I don't know how much I should talk about the particular article, but it's very, very interesting. And I think that, one of the most important things that I came to the conclusion was that climate change is not the problem, biodiversity depletion is not the problem, pollution is not the problem. The problem is the underlying ethic that makes people think it's okay to poison the air, it's
Right.
okay to poison the ocean, it's okay to poison the land. I mean, where do we even go off the rails to think that that is okay? And because once that's accepted as a necessity of quote unquote development, then everything else falls, by the wayside. But the native people never ever lost that concept that, hey, it's just not okay to do those things,
Right.
and that they're manifestations of the mysterious creative forces are present in their everyday world. And so that's a very compelling conflict, I thought.
Right. Well, thank you for that recap and that kind of overview, backward-looking overview. I appreciate it. And if I could, I'd like to just lay out just a wee bit of the context from my own body of work and some of the working assertions, if you will, that I'm including in my own books and workbooks and the support materials for folks here. It really just starts with the simplest question that I can possibly find, which is, what got us into this predicament? What got us here? And the answer in the past 5 years in writing my own book and getting stuff figured out, the answer kept coming back. We've disconnected. We've disconnected from every primary source of meaning in a human life, which I would break down, just for sake of conversation, into deeper self, relationship with others, earth, and soul. So that's really at the foundation of all the offerings that I put out there. It seems to be a very workable, simple way to hold our experience and our history for people that I work with or do coaching with or whatever. I'm wondering if that rings for you, and if you would want to add or shift anything in that simple layout that I just offered.
Well, no, I think that is it. I mean, I always go back to what Thomas Berry used to say, and he used to say that we've become autistic in terms of our relationship with the natural world, and there's a breakdown of communication. So yes, a breakdown of communication and with the natural world, so that we're no longer in contact with it, so that we're able to treat it as a real other, rather than what he used to say was instead of it's a communion of objects, and that is not something that is sustainable or something that you can really continue into the future with. And so I agree that it first has to be an internal thing, which would come back kind of more of a Thomas Merton kind of view, which very much informed Thomas Berry's point of view, because Thomas Berry was a Sanskrit scholar. He was fluent in Sanskrit. He spent 20 years in China, and so he was kind of very much along the line. And so Merton would be more of an internal. Berry was more of an external continuum of the kind of thought that you're talking about right now, I think.
Yeah. So I want to acknowledge you for one piece, and again, just kind of slide in a little bit of this context that I use, and see what your reaction is to it. So much in your article that you've already been describing, like that stark contrast between the business as usual world, the consumption-based world that's clearly causing us to collapse, the contrasting of that and the laws and the philosophies and the ethics and so on that are involved with that, as opposed to the indigenous peoples of any given area, and how those two just are so completely different. You lay out a number of historical pieces that I would be willing to guess that well over 99% of Americans have no idea about any of the things that you've included, the stories, the vignettes that you've included. And the one that really just pierces me is you're mentioning some of the Tennessee Valley Authority and how it moved its projects and its desires forward, no matter what the case or cases were that were tried to, that people tried to put in front of them. And of course, you bring in the President Andrew Jackson defied the Supreme Court to ensure access to the gold, and he ordered the military to forcibly remove the Cherokee from their land, sending them on the infamous death march known as the Trail of Tears. So two things I'm wanting to mention here about sort of the framework that I hold this information and this work in. One is that if indeed we have disconnected in every important way disconnected from the primary sources of meaning, that's deeper self, that's others, that's earth and soul. What we lose in that disconnection is we then leave ourselves with no baseline for human experience. We literally have nothing to compare it to. And what that ends up yielding us after enough decades of that level of disconnection, we end up in a fake news, alternative facts, lying world where truth truly just does not matter anymore. It holds no heft anymore. So there's that lack of baseline. And another way to say that is, the complete disconnection from the earth and the complete disconnection from other peoples. What else could conceivably allow us to take that kind of action that Andrew Jackson took to make that happen? And there's the entire story of our history with the decimation of the indigenous cultures here, and then also building our country on the backs of slaves. A remarkable and stunning amount of trauma and of disconnection. And I'm wondering, does it live sort of like I've just described it for you? Evidently it does, because I'm seeing you describe it, but I'm just wondering how it lives for you as you look back and try and hold that history, and then you bring it to us, kind of bring it current in your article. I'm wondering really the short version of the question is, how's your heart? How do you hold that kind of stuff?
Yeah, this is really crux of the matter. But it's all around us. All I have to do is step outside. I live in a beautiful, place. I live on a lava flow. This is it's called the First Mountain. So when you look west from Manhattan, what you see across the Hudson is a ridge line. It's out past Newark, and it's a giant ancient lava flow. And it's just gorgeous. There are waterfalls and streams. You get them only about 10 or 12 miles from downtown Manhattan. We have a tremendous amount of migratory birds and other species that come through here. So I draw inspiration daily just from, my local environment. It's very interesting, though, that you mentioned Jackson, because, of course, the current occupant of the Oval Office put Jackson's portrait prominently, and it's always featured behind him. Jackson, of course, what he said was John Marshall made his law, which was to say that the Cherokee could stay. So he said, John Marshall made his law, now let him enforce it. So he actually defied the Supreme Court by saying, no, I'm in control of the military. I'm in control of the military, and I'm going to do what I want to do, and I'm going to have all these people rousted, out of their homes at bayonet point and march them to Oklahoma over the winter. And that's exactly what he did, because the Supreme Court had no army. So that was an incredible, probably one of the most, other than some of the things that happened, in this century, bald-faced imperial presidency move in the history of the United States. And that's why Trump, I think, admires him so much, because he admires that dictatorial strongman kind of approach. And I'm just going to do what I want through force. You see what's happening on the borders and so forth now. So, the history, and also Jackson represents in a very real sense, I think, the continuation of colonialism, kind of a colonial, mindset, because Jackson's family was a colonial family in Ireland. So they learned a lot of the tricks that were happening at that time, of course, Ireland being the first colony, about how to manage a colony and how to treat the people who might defy the idea of foreign rule and so forth. And so, although he was very young when he came over, his family was very steeped in that tradition. I think he was Irish Protestant or whatever, British colonial. So it was just imposed then in the United States. And of course, that's what we did. We just imposed, you can go all the way back from ancient Rome. I don't hold a grudge against any particular group, because it just seems to be this flow of colonialism in Europe, which started so far, centuries and millennia ago, which was then just imposed on this country and imposed on the indigenous people here. Just a continuing flow. And a lot of the native people, I say, that they say, yeah, well, I know, we don't take it personally. It was just the way you guys did things, and it was that you hated us. It's just, that's the way you were. And, it was really awful. So the settler colonial attitude was just brutal. And as bad as it was in the East Coast, in some cases in the West Coast, we kind of reached its apex of, humanitarian disaster, where they just massacred Northern California. Of course, what would happen up there is, genocide. There's no other word for it. So he was kind of the harbinger, of colonialism in that time. And the Cherokee were very advanced, they had a very advanced civilization, culture, government, then none of that mattered to them, because they had the force in the U.S. Under Jackson could say that, we want you to do this, and you have no choice because we have the military force. So that was, in some senses, really a turning point for, and a disastrous turning point for U.S. relations with the native nations. Things could have, right then, been very different. Had he not been president, and had he not had that really colonial attitude towards the Cherokee. But yeah, no, personally, so that's what I do. I really just, when I kind of started to refocus, having gotten kind of tired of dealing with countries and governments, wanting to go back to really what drives me, which is a sense of restoration and regeneration of specific environments and watersheds, and protection of the local species. Got back involved here, and started something called River Day in my town, which is a celebration of our local watershed and a cleanup. So residents can come out. We get about 1,000 people. We load up about a couple of tons of trash from our river every year. And it's become a great community event, and it's spilled over into the creation of what we call the river curriculum in our local school. Every 7th grader in their science class now has boots. We've provided boots and a shed in the entire class. And this is a very big school district, thousands and thousands of kids. So we get them all into the river, testing the river, observing the river, and then they come up with their own independent study projects, and they produce reports or studies or videos or whatever about their river, and they then present those at River Day. So River Day has become this big festival for the community, and there's food and music, and people it's become really a central gathering day. May, usually the first weekend in May, and this is when people can actually, they have permission to get into the river. It's not a big river. It's more like, you would consider it almost a creek. It's East Branch of the Rahway, which does eventually run into the New York harbor, and then of course into the Atlantic Ocean. But as we've cleaned the river, we've started to notice that species are returning here. So we're seeing a greater diversity of bird life. We're seeing turtles coming back. We're seeing larger fish coming back as we've, over the last 10 years, been cleaning, the river and honoring the river and celebrating the river and trying to stop the trash upstream, because of course any plastic that's on the street is going to be washed into the storm drains which go into the river. People don't understand those are really underground tributaries. They were originally streams that we put into pipes, and so when everything runs off the streets, it just runs straight into the river. So people have begun to understand that they're part of this larger watershed ecosystem. So how they care for their yards, what they don't put on their yards, the species that they plant. So I don't know. I get a lot of satisfaction out of seeing a group of 12 or 13-year-olds in the river, just in wonder and walking around in their boots, taking samples, yeah, and just having a great day, yeah, for themselves. And then that's expanded to the high school. So now the environmental sciences, the AP environmental science class also has a river curriculum component where they get their kids out. And so it's developing into a whole larger process. So I think that, however we can contribute to our local situation, and however small it may seem at first, things tend to grow organically because people understand, at that deep emotional level, the threat that we're facing. Mm-hmm. And if they can do something, if they can get out in a day and make a little difference, they will. They'll show up. And it doesn't matter, rain or shine. We get people, it's raining, they show up. And with their waders, and they get in the river. And so, I get, that's one of my sources of inspiration is just my local involvement.
Great. Thank you for that. I know we only have you for a short time today, and I'd like to take particularly a particular advantage of your unique perspective, having been involved with NGOs and major governmental organizations and policymaking and so on. That's a level that most of us really rarely get anything but the tiniest waft of information. And
yeah.
We don't know about that stuff. And I guess what I'd like to ask of you is, given the administration in the USA right now, and actually in a number of other countries, it's not much better. I'm wondering if you could share a couple things. One is the particular items of concern that show up for you when you just scan over the world, and the particular issues that you're aware of and that you keep a pulse on. What are particular concerns when you look out there? And after that, if you could speak to any particular inspirations going on out there. Are there other organizations? Are there other efforts going on that give you some sense of inspiration? So if you wouldn't mind starting with the concerns, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that we're clearly in and the oil companies know, since they knew so long ago about the specific economics of what was going to happen with climate change back in the 80s. They had very top scientists. Exxon hired the best they could afford to project what they thought was going to happen with global warming and sea level rise and so forth. Then, of course, they squelched that report completely and then turned it around and tried to hide any kind of evidence that was that had been uncovered even by their own people. And then all they had to do was plant small seeds of denial that in people's minds to keep business as usual cranking along. So I'm not so much concerned about denial anymore, because it's slapping people in the face now. You look at the wildfires, you look at the floods, you look at the hurricanes, we had a tornado here last night with giant hails bouncing off the window. So people are coming around. The problem is that there's so much money sunk into the oil and gas infrastructure that it's a dying beast. It's going down swinging. So that's what we have right now. And you have people who understand that in power in the United States and in Russia and in other major fossil fuel producing countries. And so it's become kind of an international cartel. They're no longer governments. right? I mean, at that level, at the level of the president, the two presidents, they understand that the oil and gas companies put them there, they're keeping them there, and that they want to continue to extract as much profit from the infrastructure that they have in the ground and other places as possible before the big change comes. I really feel that we are in an inevitable switch of energy sources. It's just a matter of, how quickly we can shift or, that pool. My biggest concern, I'm going to tell you now, and it's the reason why I went on Twitter, was because, and I constantly put this message out, people need to start decommissioning nuclear power plants that are at or near sea level, up and down all coastlines of the world. Because one of the things I had to do when I was between jobs was work in a nuclear power plant when I was about 21, 22 years old. And when they took the cap off that reactor and I saw the power of that light come up and light up that gigantic dome room that I was in, I thought, oh, that's what we're dealing with. It's like if you take a glow stick, break it, shake it up, plug it into a billion-volt outlet. It was an unworldly color. You don't see that color. And then I started to understand how dangerous these machines were. I mean, and people don't really know what to do with the spent fuel rods and the waste that's accumulating. And so we have this highly, highly toxic radioactive stuff sitting right in the way of sea level rise. So these are some of my concerns. How quickly can we change? And it's like there's this gigantic pool of money out there that's still pumping, throwing money away basically for short-term gains in the oil and gas industry. That has to switch over into the renewable, field as soon as possible. And so that's also chugging along. Countries like Ireland and other countries completely divesting of fossil fuels and things like that. So that's very encouraging. So I mean, those are sort of my big, just the machine that is chewing up the earth, of course, and calling it GDP. So it's an essential problem that we have to resolve, is how to get off this figure that supposedly shows our economic well-being when all it's doing is taking precious natural resources and turning it into garbage as fast as possible and calling that throughput GDP into
right.
more of a...
And based on the essential lie of infinite growth on a finite planet.
That's right. So I also see it on the plus side, tremendous opportunities for young people coming out now, because everything has to be redesigned to fit into the basic life support cycles of the planet. Everything has to, I mean, we can no longer throw all this plastic away. We can no longer just pollute the air the way that we're doing. We can't do it anymore. So that means the great engineering minds of the young people that are out there are going to be put to work. They're going to have to re-engineer and redesign for regeneration so that our economy, human economy, fits within the Earth economy, and not the other way around. There is no other way around. People wonder, well, what, the environment is that many people still act as though, oh, it's something out there. It's a separate field and not the next breath you take, the next glass of water you drink, the next meal you eat. That's the environment. You are the environment. So the environment is everything. You're just one little part of it. It's not something out there. So this, it's starting to dawn on people, basically, about, how we have to approach the problem at a macro scale. And then on a micro scale, people have to really put their heads together, like a person like Buckminster Fuller and others. So they've known about this for a very, very long time, but there was just too much money to be made in the old way of doing business to let that creativity flourish. But I really think that this, in this century, if we don't totally screw things up with CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing and artificial intelligence, that young people are looking at a very good future if we can turn this corner and get really good leadership that points them in this direction.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And so, are you ready for a transition into things that you are particularly inspired by or motivated by?
Well, it's funny because Yes, I do continue to read, many of the contemporary writers in native, from the native nations. Walt Kimmerer and many other people are just fantastic. But I still go back and I'm struck by when I read Thomas Berry's work, and I am struck by Vine Deloria's work. When I go back and I read God is Red, which I think everyone should read, um, uh, about how much foreknowledge they had about where we were going and where we are at this moment. So I tend to go back and reread things surface here, but in terms of, yeah, I mean, I'm constantly coming across things, on the internet that people are doing or trying to do. I can't say, but we have Dark Mountain. That's a fantastic. I think everyone should subscribe to that. I'm also I'm encouraged by a new kind of art genre called Indigenous futurism. So a lot of the artists are saying, wait a second, it's wonderful our heritage, but how much do you focus on the ancient heritage of your ancestors versus how much do you focus on what's happening now or in the future in your artistic world? So there's Indigenous futurism is a fantastic movement, which is looking forward, Indigenous people looking forward in a very cool way and creating new cultural forms. So I think that's a very fascinating thing that does give me inspiration. I mean, it's really blooming around me all over the place. I have these two young children, so we're constantly struggling with the uses of and misuses of the digital world. And this is something that's really troubling because Silicon Valley has made it such an addicting thing. Social media for kids, they can't even talk to their peers without going through, as I call it, going through Silicon Valley anymore. So on one hand, it holds out this terrible peril about them becoming addicted to their screens. On the other hand, it does help people connect with people in their interest groups, no matter where they might be, and so forth, like we're doing right now. So that's a balance that has to be struck. And so sometimes it's very depressing and sometimes very inspirational. I mean, it's hard not to tilt the balance in terms of what's depressing, especially, when you look at the state of the world. But, on the other hand, also I try to take a look at the bigger picture. And, honestly, I try not to get too egocentric about the species, honestly. And the Earth is going to continue whether or not we exist. Other life forms are going to be here. And and I get inspired by other life forms. I'm terrifically inspired by, when I read, for example, the return of the killer whale, the attempts to return the killer whale from the Miami Seaquarium now by the Salish people and the Lummi people in Washington State who brought their totem pole all around the country, and now it's parked in front of the Miami Seaquarium because they consider that our relative who lives under the ocean. That's how they call the killer whales. And that whale has been in captivity for over 40 years. It's the last survivor from a pod that was, many of them were killed while they were taking away the younger killer whales to sell to aquariums around. Well, they're trying to get the release of that. They have a whole retirement plan, a bay that's been netted off, and they're going to put this, and they want to, just take care of this whale. It's like, wow. Tremendously inspirational, and learning their language in the way, or not their language, but their phrases for, how they interact with this killer whale, and they call this killer whale, and so forth. And of course, then science is coming from the other direction and finding out there seems to be no limit to the intelligence of, cetaceans, right? Because other animals, they seem to, as we measure intelligence, there seems to be limits. They run into limits, what they consider limits. But with dolphins and whales, they just. I was at a conference in NYU the other day, and they said we don't know what the limits are because every time we think there's a limit, there's the limit's just broken through, and then there's something else. So, so I'm encouraged also by the scientists who are doing this sort of work and bringing that to the fore. And so now the cutting edge of science is where the indigenous people were when we first got here 500 years ago. You know,
Right.
and so cutting edge science in 2019 equals 1492 knowledge that the indigenous people had in terms of interacting with other species, with landscapes, with ecosystems. And so there's a sudden convergence between the two. So I think that's very inspirational for me to see that happening in real time right now.
Yeah.
I don't know. There are many. I'm not prepared to really ask these questions, but these are just some things that come to mind.
So do you have time for one last question?
Sure.
Great. So you mentioned that you've got some young people in your world, and we've also just touched a little bit of what it is to be an activist in this world. And I'm wondering if you have anything to say about the relatively recent uprising of things like Greta Thunberg and Friday strikes for climate and for that matter, Extinction Rebellion. But I particularly wanted to lean the question toward the Friday strikes because it is very young people and it's students and it's them standing up and it's them speaking a truth that most of us as adults have long forgotten how to tell the truth at that level. I'm curious if you have any reaction to that, if that's a part of your family or your youngsters, and what you think about that the movement as a possibility. Does it have any heft to it?
Well, I always do say that, everything that we need to know, we knew when we were 6 in terms of our interaction with the environment. We lose it over time as we are indoctrinated into the autistic culture where, nature's out there, we're in here and it's different. So, we knew when we were 6, hey, don't pollute. How can you possibly pollute the water that way? How can you possibly drop that stuff? I remember being a kid and being so outraged to see people, throwing cigarette butts out, and just all the stuff. It affects kids. They know it's wrong. Yes. We get numb to it over time. So they, I think, are kind of rekindling in adults, and adults who are sensitive enough and not totally cynical about the fact, how they felt when they were young. Mm-hmm. So I think it's very important in that sense to bring adults back to their senses, slapping them back to their senses. Come on, snap out of it. And I wish that Greta had more traction in the United States, because in the United States, we're like at the epicenter of distraction for young kids. There's just, they are the focus of so much attention. Major corporations want their eyeballs and want, to give them the eye candy and the quick fun, have a great time now, and what's funny and what's cultural. And I think they certainly have that too, but I noticed there's a little bit of more of it's not quite as intense. The cultural pressure is not quite as intense to be cool, to be hip, to be, there's those, but not to be up on whatever the latest celebrity or whatever the funniest meme is or whatever. Here there's so much pressure, especially around a major city like where we live, to be an individual, to be different, yet to fit in, yet to be creative, yet to have friends, there's so much pressure to do all this stuff, and that to see her break through all that, is to me, it's fantastic. And I do try to follow her and so forth. My particular kids, they participate in River Day and so forth. But maybe it's because Dad is involved in this field so heavily that they don't want to, at this point in their lives, follow suit. So I can't say that they're heavily involved. No, I have one son who's very involved with athletics. He just happens to be born that way. And my daughter is very involved in the performing arts because she was born that way. So, and I try not to, but we do get out, and they do understand the healing powers of nature when the social pressures become too much. And I drag them out, and I get them out, and I get them, in nature as much as possible. But no, it's just at this point, teenagers. I have an 18-year-old. He's about to go to Rutgers University in the fall. and I have a 15-year-old daughter who will be going into sophomore year in high school. And, so right now they're definitely in the rebellious stage. No, I don't want to be like that. I don't want to do this stuff. Although deep down inside, it's very secure. It's in there, and it will just take a little bit more time for them to express it on their own as individuals rather than as extensions of me, if you will. So
yep.
That's where they're at.
Sure. Well, James McGowan, it's just really been a pleasure talking with you, and I think I may have actually gotten these pieces through the other things that you've shared in our time together here. But I'm wondering if you had just a minute or two on a far larger platform. Let's just say this is CNN or something huge, and given you have such a remarkable contextual and historical backdrop in your life, I'm wondering if you had that minute or so to speak to the world at large, huge audience. Do you have a few words that you could offer to folks that can perhaps motivate them in a good way?
I'm sure I would have them tomorrow if you gave me the time to think of them. But right now, I can certainly speak, I think, for the United States. I mean, and to a lesser degree for the world, but in many countries, it's also true. And that is that the tremendous groundedness of indigenous cultures that are informed about where you live hold one of the most important keys to survival of your culture, of your family, and it's also the moral and ethical thing to do, to begin to think about reparations, however that may take its form, peacemaking, however that may take its form, and a transformation of your consciousness, your point of view, towards reintegrating culture, economy into the cycles of nature instead of fighting against them. And this doesn't mean that you're going to have to give up your way of life. It just simply means that you're going to have a richer, I think, fuller way of life if you can begin to incorporate some of the wisdom of the cultures with some of the wisdom of science. And this is a very positive future if we can go this route, not a negative one. So again, it's not okay to poison the air. It's not okay to poison the water. It's not okay to poison the land. We don't need to do those things to have really rich, fun lives. So I think that is really one of the keys that I've seen with my kids and with the United States in general. People want to have fun. They want to enjoy their lives. And this is what it means to enjoy your life, I believe, to be out in a clean environment, to be engaged in activities that are fun. And it doesn't matter if you're talking about your kayaking, your stand-up paddle boarding, or whatever it may be, your cross-country skiing, your running, your biking. These are all things that people love to do, and I think it's the future. But we can only really do those things with clean air. We can only do those things with clean water. We can only do those things with clean food. So there's a holistic point of view that, you have to heal the culture, you have to heal the individual, and you have to heal the economy all at the same time, and it can be done. So, I mean, that's in a nutshell what I would say is find out who lived or lives where you are now. And where I am is the Lenape Indians who had this whole territory. And I had one of the chiefs of the tribe come down to River Day, bless the ceremony, and we had tobacco that we used to say a prayer for the river. And this is something that had been done for 10,000 years here. And it was a tremendous, I think, connection that was generated between the local current residents and their environment to do a ceremony like that. So participate in those ancient ceremonies, bring back those ancient cultures, bring with you the culture that you come from, that you're proud of. And I think that here in the United States, we can really launch this revolution because we have all these elements in place just has to be this coming together.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you so much for your writing, for your contribution, and your participation with Dark Mountain Project and all the agencies that you toured us through in your extensive history. James McGowan, thank you so much for your work and your passion, and all the best to you and your family. And I hope this is not the last time we get to talk with you here on the Poetry of Predicament.
Thank you very much, Dean. It's been a pleasure.
Take good care of yourself.
Bye now.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Also available on our website, www.livingresilience.net, is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching, and sign up for our every other Tuesday free support group that we call Safe Circle Calls.